Welcome to Celebrating Act 2. Celebrating Act 2 is the user manual for the second half of your life.
Welcome back. We're here again today with our special guest, John Mariani, and my partner, John Coleman.
Hey, John, good to see you again.
Good morning. Good to be back with you.
John, last time we talked to you, we discussed your serialized novel, Love and Pizza, that you are exposing or publishing in your newsletter every week, by chapter. And I noticed that what you've done because of the COVID-19 and nobody can eat out anymore, at least for a while yet, you replaced what you titled your New York Corner, your review of New York restaurants, with the novel.
Which takes place in New York, and there's a lot of food.
Sure, and it's about food and whatever, it's a nice love story. But I loved the New York corner, the New York City corner. And it always struck me, reading that, being from New York, as all three of us are, it always struck me that I had taken for granted what a great food city New York is. I'm growing up, I knew of all these great restaurants, and my dad would come back from meetings at Pen and Pencil, things like that. All the great steakhouses. When I first went to work in a television business in New York City, we would run out for lunch to a German place downtown, or even go around the corner to one of those Irish Blarney Stone places that had a lunch counter. Wonderful, wonderful city. And what struck me about your New York corner is that you captured not only all the feeling of restaurants, the variety of restaurants in New York City, but the world-class quality of them as well. And I'd never thought of New York City as Paris for restaurants, Berlin for restaurants. I always just thought of New York as a big place with lots of them.
Well, it is, and it is, and it has been for quite some time. But your point is well taken. When people think of great restaurant cities, they think of Paris, and that's about it. They don't really think of Berlin much, because Berlin, they had 2 world wars that didn't go too well for the restaurant industry. But Paris has always held this mystique of having the best restaurants, and it is unquestionably true that Paris has always had the best French restaurants, as you might imagine. Just as Rome was a great eating city with great Italian restaurants, and Florence well, the fact of the matter is there are more Italian restaurants in New York than there are in Florence and perhaps Rome combined. As for Paris, we can get to that in a moment. But the thing that distinguishes New York from everywhere else is because we have 250 years more, if you go back to the original Dutch settlers. We have a gastronomic history that was fed not only by the new settlers, which came from the Netherlands, which came from England, which came from down south, of course, the Spanish and the Portuguese and so forth. And then you had the Native American food culture, which had a big influence. And then the adoption of all of these people and those to follow, which we'll talk about the immigrant waves in a minute, in the 19th century, and all that followed, picked up and adapted American food, which was much more readily available in this growing city of New York, which, let's say, that New York City, up until after the Civil War, didn't even exist much above 14th Street. And the reason they call that famous apartment building the Dakota, which is on the Upper West Side, is because they said, who would live up there? You might as well live in the Dakotas. So they call it the Dakota. But yeah, New York was very, very small. Wall Street was called Wall Street to keep the Indians out. And it didn't extend much beyond that. And then one remarkable thing happened. A former Swiss sea captain. Don't you love sea captains? Well, yeah. Larson and guys like that. He retired from his seafaring days, and he opened up a little eatery down in the Wall Street area, which was copied from the French models of the restaurants and bistros of Paris, which themselves had only opened after the Napoleonic Wars. So we're talking in restaurants in as we know them in Paris are really post 1812. Well, now bump up to the 1830s, just 10 years later, and this guy whose name was Giovanni Delmonico, which he changed to John Delmonico, opened a place for the Wall Street merchants who were used to eating outside under the elm trees, the beech trees, and or going to a tavern. We always had taverns, but tavern is a place like, you eat whatever was put in front of you and you drank whatever was put in front of you. You had no choice. You had no menu. You just ate this basic slop. Well, John Delmonico opened a place which he called Delmonico's, and he had a menu, and people would peek in and say, like, what is this? And he had French wines that he had imported, as well as New York wines, which were then being produced. And he had a lady cashier. This was like a phenomenon, to have a woman up front taking your money. Remarkable. He later installed a revolving door, the first one in America. So Delmonico's took off very, very quickly. And within just a couple of years, it was being copied. And he opened considerably as New York moved uptown from Wall Street, so did the various Delmonicos. He got as high, he went up to Fifth Avenue and where Madison Square Garden used to be. And they got more and more opulent. And the second one, which is on Beaver Street in the Wall Street area, is still extant, still has the same portals outside. And it's a grandiose and wonderful restaurant. It's closed at the moment. And Delmonico's was the first in America. The second was in New Orleans, which is still operating also, Antoine's, which opened, I think, about 1839, 1840, something like that. And that was a very French restaurant because New Orleans was very, very French. So, but to get back to New York, after that, after the Civil War, that's when the great influxes of the immigrants came from Europe, largely, and to a certain extent, the Chinese came. The Chinese mainly settled in the West. They built the Chinatowns, but they built a Chinatown in New York. I've been watching this great, really wonderful PBS series on the Asians and how much they suffered as did any other Asians, any other cultures who came to the United States and were sinned upon greatly, let's say. Well, Chinatown and all eateries, grocery stores, wine shops, these were very easy things for immigrants to open and to get into. So when the Jews came, they opened delicatessens, serving an Eastern European style of Jewish food, some of which did not exist back in the old country. But that's really like an Ashkenazi Jewish kind of cuisine, Polish, Romanian, okay? The Germans who came from certain sections with the sausages and the Wurst in Bavaria, the Germans in New York were that Bavarian Gemütlichkeit, Papa bands. It's Nasta, they had them bring the map down. It's this Nasta. And they were up in Yorkville, which is 86th Street and 3rd Avenue and Lexington Avenue. And there was a whole slew of German restaurants up there, and a lot of fun. Great German beer and Pilsner and so forth. The Italians were all over. They had Little Italy. Certainly, they opened there, and they had pockets, big pockets in the Bronx. We were talking about that in the Fordham section, and in Brooklyn, and all over the city. The pizzeria, which comes from Naples, but was unknown. Pizza was unknown in all of Italy outside of Naples. But the idea came to America with the immigrants, and in 1912, they opened the first pizzeria in America, which is still going strong today. And it's called G. Lombardi's. They still have the original stove. And so the Italians did that. The Greeks came and for some reason got into the diner business, which they hadn't been back in Greece, but they also opened Greek cafes, as did the Turks, as did the Syrians, as did the Albanians, and so forth. The Irish, as you made note about going to the Blarney Stone, the Irish did not have a highly developed well, none of them had highly developed cuisines. The Italians, for instance, the poor Italians never went to a restaurant back in the old country. Neither did the Germans. No one knew what a restaurant was. The Irish had been starving, and the reason that they came over was, of course, the potato famine. So they really had no restaurant background whatsoever. No trattorias, no rathskellers. So they opened these Irish bars, and you had to have some food. And out of that came things like corned beef and cabbage, which is to this day unknown in Ireland. So a lot of the dishes that we have on our plates in New York are completely unknown. Pastrami is not a big deal, and certainly not in Israel. You're not going to. The bagel really had its success here rather than Jewish communities back in the old country. So everybody brought their own style. The Chinese certainly first, mostly Cantonese, so it's mostly Cantonese food. But there's no egg foo young. There's no chow mein in China. And then you had Rocky Aoki, who opens up Benihana, which is the teppanyaki type of restaurant with steak, which didn't exist in Japan either. And when they opened one over there, they call it Benihana of New York rather than Benihana of Tokyo. So all of these immigrant groups made New York very, very, very rich in terms of restaurants, which appealed to many people and extrapolated to the whole population. So no matter what ethnic family you grew up in, the one thing when I remember that Neil Simon says is two things Jews know: guilt and where to find a Chinese restaurant open on Sunday. So the Jews would go to Chinese, and everybody said, "Hey, want to go for Chinese? Hey, let's go for Italian. Hey, let's go get a pizza.
Yeah.
Let's go to an Irish bar." So everybody did it and enjoyed it immensely. And in other parts of the country, of course, specifically after the Vietnam War, the Southeast Asians went to the West first. Now, we do have in New York many great Thai restaurants, Vietnamese restaurants, Burmese restaurants, certainly Indian restaurants. But that great influx was to the Pacific Northwest, Minnesota. The seafood industry in Houston is controlled by the Thais and the Vietnamese. So they have more of that. And Los Angeles has more Mexican restaurants than we do. But Mexican restaurants in New York tended to be Cuban-style restaurants, which were stylized after Spanish restaurants. But we just have more of everything. And to go back to Paris being the citadel of haute cuisine, as well as bistro food. Haute cuisine was this exquisite, impeccably served, beautiful tables, beautiful tablecloths and linens and chandeliers and silverware that weighed a pound per fork, and a great wine list. This was pretty much the purview of Paris as it was established back in the 19th century by a fellow named Auguste Escoffier, who wrote the Bible of French cuisine. So that everybody learned to cook, or was going to be cooking for a restaurant anywhere, had to read that book, had to know how to make a béarnaise sauce, had to know how to make coq au vin, had to know how to make a creme caramel. All of these things are in that book, and you never deviated at all. And in New York, the French restaurants that existed before World War II were of a very mediocre sort. They're more like bistros, but they didn't have the ingredients. They didn't have the foie gras. They didn't have fresh wild mushrooms. They didn't have so many ingredients, creme fraiche and other things that the French just take for granted. So the food could not be as good as it was in France. What happened was that in 1939, the World's Fair, New York World's Fair, they brought from all over the world. There was the Italian pavilion and the French pavilion and the Chinese pavilion and so forth. And that was a remarkable, remarkable thing. And a lot of those, the cooks stayed behind. Well, the biggest and best of the restaurants of the World's Fair was called Le Pavillon, the French pavilion. And it had food every bit as good as in Paris because they brought over Paris chefs and they brought over Paris maitre d', a guy named Henri Soulet, who was the manager. So if you went to Le Pavillon, you ate the way you were eating in Paris, except even he couldn't get at that time the ingredients that he would love to. He once said that I have the richest people dine in my restaurant every single night, and no matter what I pay, I cannot get them the things that a simple French bourgeois housewife serves to a family every day. So, 1939, 1940, 41, the world explodes into World War II, and Henri Soulet picks up his knives and forks and ladles and so forth, and much of his staff, and brings them into New York, into Manhattan in the West 50s, East 50s, and he opened a pavilion there, which set the standard for the next 40 years. Let's say it was 42, 43. So yeah, for the next 30 to 40 years, for what an haute cuisine French restaurant would be, all of which began with either le or la. There was la caravelle, there was le quercy, there was le madrigal, they call them le and la, they call it the frog pond. One place called it la grenouille, which means the frog. And that was a society place, still around today. It was called, and there was a frog sitting on a lily pad on the menu, and that was strict haute cuisine. That was called the frog pond. So little by little, as the ingredients got better, not only for French food, but for Italian food, where you could really get the real prosciutto from Parma, and you could really get the real Parmigiano. You could get extra virgin olive oil. You could get great wines. You could get funghi porcini. All of those ingredients that make great Italian food were now available. So too, the French were able to get all those things they didn't have before. The Chinese were. Everybody was able to get better ingredients. So all the restaurants got better and therefore more competitive. And where once, and this was true in California as much as it was in New York, the ex-hippies of the 1960s grew up, and where they had been cooking counterculture cuisine in their what do they call them, communes and so forth. Beans, the musical fruit. They would make lots of beans and sunflower seeds and carrot cake, which they would stuff full of LSD. That was hippie food. But those hippies grew up to be, afterwards, because they had this basis in cooking. They were all college educated. Some of them had advanced degrees, started to cook seriously. And out of that grew California cuisine, and a good deal of it in New York, too, where people who had shown any interest in cooking were college kids who, just like all of us, spent half a year or went over to Europe and ate around and say, wow, why doesn't the Italian food in New York taste like this in Naples and Rome? And they found out why, largely because of the ingredients and other things. So the food across the board in every ethnic cuisine, Swedish food, Norwegian food, German food. Although German food is sad for one reason. Because of the two world wars, specifically the Second World War, Germans were at a severe disadvantage. And consequently, a lot of the Yorkville German restaurants closed down. So I think there's only one, maybe two. And finding German food outside of the Midwest, and even there, is very difficult these days.
John, the New York City cuisine, or whatever we call it, the cuisine scene in New York City still remains world class. If you want, there's plenty to find in haute cuisine, but it's also got dozens and millions of corner restaurants that are family restaurants, little bars where we would go for lunch that serve food, and they were, you could get a great hamburger, but it's custom made, and it's the variety and it's the volume.
I would also add the consistency that, if you get a corned beef pastrami sandwich at a Jewish deli in any borough, I don't know so much about Staten Island, but the rest of them, they would be uniformly delicious, and you would know what to expect.
Yeah,
the pickles were sour pickles, and they were plentiful, and they were on the table.
Dr. Celery tonic.
Yes, Dr. Brown.
He knows about Dr. Celery tonic, very, very New York thing, as well as Yoo-hoo chocolate drink, and a few things like that that are very specific to New York, and nobody could figure out, why do people drink that stuff, you know. But it's very much part of the culture. Dr.
Well, I
Sel-
look forward to
Nope.
the day when we are all going back to restaurants locally, wherever we are,
Yeah.
but particularly in New York, where I know things are going to be a little bit different. But I'm looking forward to your reviews, your new reviews of the restaurants
I
after the
can't wait.
COVID-19.
I can't wait.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Great history lesson.
Anytime.
And a lot of this
Culinary
history
tour of
in
food.
between these episodes, people can go to johnmariani.com, where you've been publishing as a virtual gourmet for a long time. Uh,
22.
how many years?
22.
22 years. And just going through the archives, there's so many fascinating stories told richly. As I like to think of them, you basically are creating a recipe for each topic and serving a multi-course meal. So
Well,
for
it's
that,
well,
we thank you.
thank you for having me on. Always.
See you again soon. Bye.
For more on Celebrating Act 2, visit our webpage, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and tell your friends. Celebrating Act 2 is the user manual for the second half of your life.